We're going to talk. We'll get into a little bit of history tonight. I don't try not to be too boring, but there's some really neat quotes and things I'll share that kind of led up to the establishment of the Second Amendment and why it's so important. And I think many of us, there are many gun owners here. Thanks, guys. There are many gun owners, and I think a part of being a gun owner is you naturally defend that right, okay? Think about the arguments that show up every time there's a mass shooting. Right? Well, we just got to get rid of all guns, okay? Because another law against guns would have stopped the illegal act of a mass shooting, correct? I mean, these guys aren't doing mass shootings lawfully. You understand that, right? Okay. They already broke the law to do that. And so we think of some of the arguments. We think of some of the things that are attached to that. But we have to ask ourselves, where did these principles come from? There's definitely, there's arguments from logic and statistics. There's arguments of morality, and I think there's some arguments from the Bible itself, and we'll look at some of those, but this is one of my favorite ones. Luke 22. Look what the Bible says. Jesus is meeting with the disciples. He's about ready to get taken. Now, when the disciples were with Jesus, who met their needs and who took care of them? It's the Sunday school question, Sunday school answer. Jesus. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Of course, with me, it's usually like, I think the answer is the Bible. Yeah, it's in the Bible. Jesus met their needs, right? All those people followed him into the wilderness, and they were hungry, and he said, we can't just send them away hungry. What did Jesus do? He fed the 5,000, right? Took a little boy's lunch, and boom, he took care of them. But he's preparing his disciples for the fact that he's about to go away. And here's what it says. Let's start in verse, let's do verse 35. This is after he told Peter that he was going to deny him and so forth. Verse 35, and he said unto them, when I sent you without purse and script and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said nothing. So he sent them out, and they didn't have anything. And you think of all the times when he said, just go to this place, there'll be someone there, and just say, hey, the master hath need of it. And he'll take care of it, right? Verse 36, then said he unto them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his script, that be his money that goes in the purse. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. So he's saying, if you don't have a sword, sell anything you have extra of and go buy a sword, right? Now, the equivalent of that today would be anybody who doesn't have an AR-15, go sell your PlayStation and go buy something useful. Buy a AR-15. Right? What was that? What did the Romans use as a weapon in these days? They used a sword, a sidearm, right? And he said, get something comparable. And it's really interesting the reason. He says, for I say unto you that this is written that must be accomplished in me, that he was reckoned among the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. And they said, Lord, behold, here are 2 swords. And he said unto them, it is enough. It is enough for what? It is enough to fulfill the prophecy that he'd be numbered among the transgressors. Now, let me ask you this question. Do you think a Jew in first century Roman occupation was allowed to open carry? No. Jews did not have that right. Romans could carry. But even that is it was very frowned upon to open carry. But Romans were allowed to. Jews were not. Yet Jesus tells them, get a sword, because it needs to be accomplished that he was numbered among the transgressors. In other words, if you were a Jew and you were carrying, you looked like what? A criminal. Isn't that interesting? But he tells them, go get a sword. Well, what's the point of a sword? And then he said, we have 2. He said, that's enough to fulfill that prophecy. Kind of an interesting statement. But why would we have a sidearm? Why is that important? If you are a good moral citizen, why is having a weapon important? Well, I never know if I need to attack somebody. Is that a thought process? How many are carrying here tonight? Are you serious? Are we undefensible right now? Oh, my. Okay, we usually have about a dozen in here, okay? So I guess I should have grabbed mine tonight. I actually thought about just kind of keeping it right here. Wow, I'm a little nervous now all of a sudden. Boy, lock the door, okay? This is streaming. We just announced to everybody we were vulnerable. Anyways. No, a citizen, a responsible citizen carries for defense. Because I never know if I might need this, right? I never know. And so this is going to be the mindset that we're going to look at as we unpack this Second Amendment. So what does the Second Amendment say? A well-regulated militia, boy, this is written in the fancy cursive. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be what? Infringed. Now, it's written a little awkward. The main phrase there is not the well-regulated militia. It's not the security of a state. It is the rights of the who? The people shall not be infringed. And we'll unpack that a little bit. Let's ask God's help tonight. Father, I pray that you'd help us as Bible-believing people to consider that life comes from you. And when you created man in your image. And there was something special about this part of creation, that you stamped your image in it, and by that, there is value. And Lord, because of that this is not a topic to be taken lightly, but you've given us the responsibility to steward these bodies, and a part of that is indeed self-defense. And Lord, I just pray that you'd help us to get a good balanced approach and balanced view of this, and even see what was in the mind of our founders when they framed this, and why it is important. Help us in these next few moments. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. On June 8, 1789, Mr. Madison, in the first session of the United States Congress, proposed that a newly ratified Constitution be altered to include a preface articulating the political philosophy of self-governance, namely that governments derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Hey, that's a new idea. It's bottom-up government, right? Boy, wouldn't that be great if we could remind Washington of that truth? You govern with consent of the governed. In fact, a couple of years ago, our local representative, Mike Prox, gave a speech kind of along those lines when we were still dealing with some COVID things. And he stood up and he said, I want to talk about consent. And he was quoting this whole thing, this consent of the governed from our Declaration of Independence. And how important that is. It's with consent. But anyways, I don't want to get off track here. But that's where we get our, these just powers are with the consent of the governed, that it is limited in its purpose to the benefit of the governed. In other words, government is to be limited in purpose for the benefit of those that are being governed. And finally, that the rights of the people to alter and abolish government is indubitable. I love that word. It just rolls off the tongue. Indubitable. Unalienable and indefeasible. You cannot take this away. And what's amazing about this word, the word unalienable, how have you heard the word unalienable? Unalienable rights. That word is a really neat word because it's very rich in meaning. It's not just that it cannot be separated from somebody or alienated from somebody, but that it cannot be taken from them by force or voluntarily. In other words, you cannot voluntarily give up these rights. Isaiah may come to me and he says, Pastor, I would like to be sold into slavery under you. You know, I'd say based on our Constitution, you cannot give up your rights. They show up at my door, you're not allowed to have a slave? No, he told me I can. He signed right here on the dotted line that he will be my lifelong slave. I'm sorry, you can't. That would be illegal, even if you did it willfully, right? So we're just not going to call it slavery. We'll just call it something else. And then he'll be my servant. No, you can't just give it up arbitrarily, okay? And so Madison went on in talking about how he followed by proposing that the insertion of clauses guaranteeing individual liberties as specified at specified places throughout the Constitution included a provision for protection of the people's rights to keep and to bear arms. And not going to go through all of them, but in his Article 1, Section 9, between clauses 3 and 4, he has this list of these basic human rights. And included in that was the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This was in the basic human rights there. And then he said, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no persons religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. And that was kind of the base of that, then goes into some of these other ones. But I want to kind of break down the language of this, and we'll go into the history of it, and then some of the Bible principles that led to it, and we'll be done. But let's look at the language. As we look at the language of the Second Amendment, it's really made up of two parts. Part 1 may be called the preamble phrase. Well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And Part 2 may be called the substance clause of the amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The structure of the Second Amendment, therefore, is as follows. Because the truth of the preamble, because of the truth of that, because that truth is accepted, rather, then in this case, the rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In other words, what he was saying is this preamble part of this well-regulated militia and the security of the state, in order to accomplish this, we cannot infringe on the rights of the people to keep and bear arms. Is that okay, paraphrase? See, it's worded kind of weird because when we read in English, we kind of, let's get to the important things first, and then we'll kind of define it later. And this kind of lays out this preamble. Because of these truths, this is what it is. So if we're to boil it down to the simplest phrase in the Second Amendment, is simply this: the rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, period. By the way, there's no exception clause in Second Amendment. That's interesting. And what did they mean by that? Isn't that what's debated? What did they mean? The occupant of the White House, when he's in debates about the Second Amendment, or discussion when he had more of his faculties, he was talking about how, well, even the Second Amendment, the time of the revolution, when the time of its framing, had limitations. Now, is that a true statement? The mindset of the founders was that in order to keep tyranny at bay, and in order to secure this free state, that the people, their right to keep and bear arms, needed to be at the same level as the military, as any foes that would come along. Now, I'll say this: we're far removed from that, are we not? Okay? But here's what the reasoning was. This is about muskets. For example, a regular citizen could not have a cannon. I love it when he said that night. The fact checkers went wild. I was like, I don't think that's true. And I started looking it up. Is that a true statement? Of course citizens had cannons. In fact, if I was back then, I'd have one on either side of my front door, okay? I would be ready to go. All right, enter if you will, if you dare. But did you know one of the most powerful ships during the War of 1812 was a civilian-owned merchant ship, and it was the most armed, more than any of our battleships. And it took out more of the British fleet than any of our military. He basically got, I can't remember what you call it, but basically he got commissioned by our government to fight on their behalf, and from his merchant ship with cannons. How cool is that? I mean, I love the history of stuff that went around there. My wife and I got to go to Fort McHenry, and we got to see, this was before the bridge collapsed, we got to see Francis Scott Key Bridge there, and we got to stand on the rampart. And that was, by the way, that's what inspired our nation's anthem, right? And we got to see the flagpole where Francis Scott Key was looking, and he said, the flag's still there. It was just so cool standing there. Francis Scott Key, as he's out there on the British ship, trying to negotiate the release of some of the Americans' prisoners, watched this battle unfold throughout the night, and the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. And as the smoke and the haze would clear, he'd say, oh, there's Old Glory. It's still there. It's still there. And that inspired that song. Well, that's going on. The general there in Fort McHenry, who's leading the charge, and they knew exactly where their cannons could reach, so they weren't going to waste anything. They waited till the boats just got close enough, and they learned where the line was. And he's just given the royal fleet all that he's got. One generation later, the grandson of Francis Scott Key and the grandson of that general were both in jail on that same base in issues relating to slavery. It was really just kind of interesting, just all the rich history that was going on there. And these guys, of course, they were. That was kind of the line of the North and the South during the Civil War. I say one generation, I don't remember, but grandsons. They were the grandsons, okay, when they're dealing with those issues. But anyways, just all that history there. But so much of it comes back to this issue. What was it that they had in mind? And what was the backdrop of what was taking place? Did America win its freedom by honoring gun regulations? What did the British think about guns? Did the British believe in gun rights? Or did they believe in gun regulation? Did you know one of the last straws before the Declaration of Independence was written was that the British troops started trying to round up people's weapons? Nope, that's too far. You've already gotten us with taxation without representation. You've already gotten us with all these things. You've already gotten us, by the way, with religious persecution. You've already gotten us in all these areas. We are not going to lay down our arms. And there's the big debate, who fired first, right? But this is where it came to a head. Lay down your weapons. And is this not the age-old deal? Is this not the age-old discussion? This goes all the way back to ancient Rome, right? Was it the Spartans were told to lay down their weapons, and they said, come and get it. Come and take it from us. Why? Because you know if you have no weapons, you will be dominated. Just like we talked about last week, you know if the city had no walls, what were the walls about? The same issue. Self-defense. You can be dominated. You can be overtaken. So, see why this is so important. How do you secure your freedom of speech? How do you secure your freedom of religion, freedom to assemble? How do you secure freedom in your own neighborhood? Well, that's why we have cops. Folks, I don't care how big or how small your community is. Does everybody have a police officer outside their door? No. Even in North Pole, that if there's an issue, they're going to send, the whole fleet, all the cars come out. Like, what's going on there? Why does everybody come out? Because there's nothing going on. But think about it now. Which is faster, drawing a sidearm or dialing 911 and waiting? Last church we were at, we had some cameras set up because we had some homeless people coming in and taking our food and stuff. And I remember getting an alert on my phone at 3 in the morning, and I called 911. You know how many questions I had to answer before I actually gave them the information? It's like there is a literal crime in progress right now. All right, and give me your name and what's a good callback number and we're going through all this. Just dispatch I was getting so frustrated before they even got the address of what I was calling about. Filling in all this stuff. What I'm saying is this, that if somebody was there, they could have taken care of the situation. I'm not saying you shoot the guy. What I am saying is there's a boldness in defending yourself and your property when you are properly armed. I got to get through this. We're breaking down the language. Preamble uses the terms that require definition in order to rightly be understood. When it kind of breaks it down, I think the preamble is what kind of confuses people sometimes when we look at it. The terms in the substance clause, the core clause of the sentence in the Second Amendment, are straightforward. Nevertheless, a quick review of the meaning of the significant terms in the clause will help us appreciate the significance. The word right here it's used as a noun. It carries the meaning of moral and or legal entitlement to have or obtain or act in a certain way. The expression "the people" refers to the whole of the population and extends the right stipulated to every person in the population. Keep and bear refers to the right of the people to own, to have in their possession, and to make use of that which is the right of the people to keep and to bear. Arms, of course, refers to weapons. The key phrase shall not be infringed. The main term in there is infringe, which means to violate the terms of law or agreement by way of limiting or undermining or encroaching on one's legal rights. So the meaning of the substance clause is clear. The right, moral, and legal authority of the people, every person, to keep and to bear, own, possess, and use arms, weapons, shall not be infringed, limited, undermined, or encroached upon. Objections are raised against the plain meaning of the substance clause by questioning the meaning of significance of certain terms in the preamble phrase. The debate's always about the preamble. What is the well-regulated militia? So they'll bring up arguments. Well, that's our military. Is that what the founders meant? I don't have time to get into it all, but there is a statement after statement that the well-regulated militia is this: the responsibility of the citizenry to know how to use their weapons. And there was even debate about, should we make it a law, a requirement, that every able-bodied citizen has to carry? And they thought, that kind of goes the other direction, because it's a freedom issue. It's a choice issue. What's interesting about this, let me kind of skip through some of these notes quicker. Issues like that the ACLU raises, the American Communist Lawyers Union, and others, that are like them, they say it's referred to, the state is referred to the overall, whereas what were they referring to as a state? And they kind of play these word games. What are we talking about here? This well-regulated militia, well, that's the military, or that's the police force, and these are well-regulated. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because let me ask you military guys, are there regulations in the military? Too many. Police force, are there regulations in the police force? Absolutely, right? But is that what we're talking about? Well-regulated is that we are a disciplined citizenry that are responsible in carrying our weapons. By the way, if it's responsible gun ownership, we use that term a lot, right? Responsible gun ownership. That's important, by the way. Responsible gun ownership. If you make more laws about guns, does that impact the responsible gun owner, or does that impact the unlawful gun owner? The responsible one. Lawbreakers will still break laws. You see, it's not like they have a limit. Like, you know what, I'll break 5 laws in this crime, but I'm not going to break 6. That's my limit. They don't think through it that way. You see? And we understand. I mean, I know you guys. We understand that there's not much logic behind that. But folks, these are some of the arguments that are brought up. Because after all, why would you need a 30-round magazine? To which we respond, none of your business. It shall not be infringed. And infringed even goes to the point of limiting. What are we talking about here? Now, we do have, obviously, some laws about, automatic weapons. And but I love when people say, the AR-15 is an automatic rifle. No, it's not an automatic rifle. Okay. They're going out there with semi-automatics. That sounds so aggressive. People that don't know what guns are, all that means is you pull the charging handle once and you can shoot multiple times. That's all them, oh, that's so scary. That's what a hunting rifle is, okay? But they use these terms hoping that ignorant people who don't know how it works, I love the one congresswoman said, I shot an AR-15 at a gun range and I have PTSD now. I'm sorry? Or the person that was standing, this is the size hole that an AR-15 makes, and there's a big old bazooka hole. It's like, no, this is about the one that it makes. But anyways, or the Kyle Rittenhouse case, if some of you were following that, the prosecutor was talking about hollow points. And don't you realize that hollow points explode in the person once it enters in? And he's like, I don't think that's accurate. They got to the point where even the judge said, counselor, you need to get your facts straight before you start bringing these things up. They don't explode inside of you, okay? But anyways, those are some of the games that are played by ACLU and others by trying to scare people into these things. And by the way, let me just say this: I don't want to sound calloused or cold whenever there is a shooting, whenever there is something going on. It does tug at our heartstrings, and especially when children are involved. But one of the things about conservatism is we try to use level head and think with facts, not feelings. That's a tough discipline. Because if that was my child, I'd want to see every gun wiped out. But I also know that that is not realistic. That we have guns pouring in from our southern border if we wanted. If they're banned and they're completely outlawed in America, I promise you they will flow in from our southern border. And they are unmarked and they are untraceable. So if they're going to get here anyway, and I can't call 911 fast enough, I'm not faster than a speeding bullet, then it's up to me to protect my family. That's the mind. That's common sense. That's logic. That's what the founders had in mind. Let me speed along here. One interesting thing when people try to make a constitutional argument is the weakness of their own arguments and in the meaning of the Second Amendment. It's really interesting. One person observed, to put it mildly, the Second Amendment is not at the forefront of constitutional discussion, at least as registered in what Academy regards as the venues for such discussion. Law reviews, case books, and other scholarly legal publications. As Professor Laurie had recently written, the Second Amendment is not taken seriously by most scholars. And what they mean by that is not that the amendment is not taken seriously, but the arguments. Sanford thinks the Second Amendment crowd virtually ignores it because, virtually ignores it is because the amendment is embarrassing to them. That when faced with argument, their ability to get around the plain language of the amendment is embarrassing to their efforts to limit it, to apply only states and not to individuals. In other words, when they try to have an actual argument based on the plain language, it is very embarrassing to come up with a well-articulated argument. And that's why sometimes they do sound so funny. When ignorant congressmen, I guess that counts for men and women, get up there and try to make an argument, you think, have you ever even seen a gun? Do you know how this is made, how this happens? Because it does sound foolish, but think about it. Their arguments are never on a legal basis. They're on an emotional basis. That child would have been saved. Trump's ear would have been saved. I'm glad we can joke about that, by the way. I'm very thankful that he was spared. But if we lost him, I promise you, if President Trump was assassinated for the first time since he's been in politics, the left would all of a sudden care about Trump. Oh, we lost such a great leader. If only we had more gun rates. See what I'm saying? If only we had more regulation. The Republicans would not have lost the greatest leader they ever. All of a sudden, they'd be singing his praises. It's my prediction. I think it would have gone that far. But anyways, move on. I want to share with you some of the things, the history of the Second Amendment. Brief overview of history of gun control. We'll look at some specifics here in just a minute, and even what God expects. But let's go all the way back to creation, Genesis 1 and 2. When God breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life, making man in the image and likeness of God, the essential principle right to defend that life was endowed to him. In Genesis 9:6, when God instructed Noah that whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, and premised upon the act of creation, saying that the rationale for this rule rests in the fact that man was created in the image and likeness of God. He grounded the natural light and self-preservation in this act of creation. This separated man from all other beasts, which God put under the dominion of man, in Genesis 1:26. Distinguishing man as special creation, not included in those things over which he may exercise dominion. Throughout the time of the law, God provides protections to those who kill another man in defense of his own person or property, Exodus 22:2 and 3. There are many occasions after Exodus in which God called his people to arms to execute wrath upon evildoers and to throw off oppressors. By the way, if you kill somebody in an act of war, working on behalf of your government or of your country, fighting an enemy of your country, let me ask you this question. Are you guilty of murder? I've dealt with a lot of Christians that struggle with thou shalt not kill who have taken life in war. Understand something. The Ten Commandments were given to Israel as personal responsibility in civilization, in society. The Ten Commandments were not given to a nation. You just said they're given to Israel. They're not given to a nation. They're given to the individuals that were in Israel. Okay? It's a lot different when you're talking about war. In fact, in the Bible calls God a man of war. He had the prerogative to exercise judgment and use nations to rise against nations. He would do that. He would do that with other nations to discipline his own people. Okay? David, a man after God's own heart, was a warrior. And what was he doing? When he killed Goliath, God did not judge him. That was his nation's enemy. But when he killed Uriah, that was a personal issue. And in fact, he deserved death, and God showed mercy. You see the difference? And I know we can start getting into, what about Nazi Germany and all that kind of stuff? Listen, there is always a higher authority. And if you feel like there's something immoral going on, then you have the obligation to appeal to the higher authority. But let's continue. The tactic of oppressors to deprive the people of necessary arms to defend themselves has ancient roots. In Judges, the book of Judges, Deborah made a reference to her people being disarmed in Judges 5:8. Later on, it suggests that Israel's lax condition spiritually, either that they ignored their own defenses, or while under oppression by the Moabites as judgment of their sins, they were not allowed to own weapons. In Samuel 13, 19 and 20, we learn that the Philistines oppressed Israel. They enforced restrictions against producing swords and spears so that Israel was without weapons to defend themselves. When they cried out to God, he defended them and delivered them from their oppressors. Obviously, God commanded the sword of Moses, the sword of Joshua, the sword of Gideon, and of course, David to execute wrath upon the doers of evil, to establish and maintain justice among the people. By the way, we sometimes forget Samson. Samson's known for what? Known for strength, but what was his downfall? He's known for that. He's known for supernatural strength and stupid choices when it comes to women. Who was Samson? He was one of God's judges. And what was he doing? Executing wrath upon the Philistines. As God's judge. He was in a spiritual position for God. You think, wow. By the way, God has some tough choices to choose from sometimes. I love that. If God can use a donkey, he can use you. But anyways, that's going to be our slogan in honor of the Maoris when they leave. If God can use a donkey, he can use you. The picture in our kitchen, by the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about. Nowhere in the Bible is there a mention of a law restricting people from keeping and bearing arms. Owning weapons as was unrestricted by God's political economy for his people. The only time we see restrictions on this presumed natural right of the people is when they're under oppression by some tyrant. The Greeks and the Romans, 400 BC to 400 AD, had no restriction on citizens owning weapons, but did restrict carrying them in public places. In some cases, it was a mutually shared value and done voluntarily. In other city-states, it was enforced by law. The sense was that carrying weapons in public in time of peace sent a message that the weapons ruled rather than law. And that was part of the philosophy and whatnot that kind of played into that, but they did believe you should have a weapon. Here we only went to overview of the history of gun laws, but think about this just for a minute. Those supporting restrictions on carrying arms in public argue that ancient Greeks viewed the carrying of arms in public spaces as a revolutionary move to overthrow the Constitution. Even those who support restrictions admit they are intended to protect the interest of the government. Think about that. Using those arguments are actually saying that. So it's important. Its intent is to protect protecting the element. Let me move on. But that was about protecting the interest of the government, not the interest of the people. All of these admit some official force must be armed to protect the peace. The argument is that why should only those in the employ of our rulers have guns? The presence of guns is ambiguous. You think about this. Have you ever stood in a coffee shop and a police officer walks in and has a sidearm on? How do you feel? Do you feel threatened? Do you feel safe? Most of us feel safe because we haven't had a negative encounter, right? I know there are those that definitely have had a negative encounter that might, cause something, right? But think about this. If he's trained and he's there and he's able to carry that, should he not also be allowed, in civilian clothes, as a responsible gun owner, to open carry as well? Now, I know a lot of police officers off duty in states that don't have open carry will have a concealed carry and whatnot. I'm thinking from my experience in California and whatnot, off duty. But think about this. We allow for those kinds of things. Is that not kind of proving that there brings some peace? I was beginning the process of getting my concealed carry permit when I was in California. I was in one of the few counties that was that was kind of easier to get one. All the others were tied up with lawsuits. And so I was going through the steps. But you sit down and you have a class that the local sheriff puts together. And you know what his first thing he says? He says to everybody there, he says, "Thank you. You guys are our first line of defense." That's the perspective of police officers in California, because they know they're outnumbered and their job is way too big and they never have enough. They believe in that. And that's in liberal California, because they know what's really going on. They understand these things. By the way, it's interesting that military and law enforcement tend to be a little bit more conservative, because they see the direct ramifications of policies and things going on. Why is it such a big deal on who the Border Patrol endorse? They see the direct ramifications of policies that are going on. The restrictions among Romans in ancient societies certainly can be appreciated to natural right of self-defense. Roman law was protected of the individual's rights to defend himself and his property from violence. Whether offered by a thief in the darkened highway or a soldier in search of plunder, provision attributed to the late 4th century era AD. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's several readings from those early days talking about, here's one: "We grant to all persons the unrestricted power to defend themselves." Get that now. Unrestricted for the purpose of defending themselves, so that it is proper to subject anyone, whether a private person or a soldier, who trespass upon the fields at night in search of plunder or lays by busy roads, plotting to assault passers-by, to immediate punishment in accordance with the authority granted to all. Let him suffer the death which he threatened and incurred that which he intended. In other words, if somebody is going to mug somebody and you are armed, they say you have every right to take that man's life for trying to kill you. That would have changed the story of the Good Samaritan, because that's exactly what happened to that guy, right? He got jumped on this highway. I know Jesus was giving a parable and laying this thing out, but that was not an uncommon thing. And their law was, you have every right to defend yourself. There's several others like that. By the time we come to English law, we find a mixed history. From King Alfred in AD 871 to 901, requiring all subjects in his realm to keep arms and be trained in their use. He required them to be armed and trained and be ready to serve in a citizen army. And then we come to Charles II in 1661, disarming what he deemed were disaffected persons. That is, persons who demonstrated against his abuse and his political enemies. During this period, the people began to feel their strength in number, and with the leadership of men like Cromwell and others, came to believe that they had a voice in how they were ruled. It became a maxim, to some say, originating with Aristotle, that whoever controls the guns controls the crown. The people soon learned that an armed citizenry under popular leadership was the only effective check against the abuse of a king. See, we understand that we're looking back at history, but as they're going through it, this was the reasoning and what was going on there. The English became suspicious of anyone who attempted to interfere with what they regarded was their natural right to keep and bear arms. Sir William Blackstone, 1723 to 1780, famous for his commentaries on English common law, spoke of two classes of rights. One he called absolute, arising from natural and endowed to man by his creator, and the other he called relative, that arose from man's relation to others in society. He considered the right to keep and bear arms to be an absolute class arising from nature and endowed upon him by nature's God. The fundamental right to life included in his mind the right to defend it. Likewise, that all other natural and endowed rights presumed the right to defend them against tyranny. He saw this right as having two applications, one public and one private. The public use of the right was to restrain the violence of oppression. The private use was for self-preservation. In other words, what he was saying is based upon this, we as a people need to make sure that the government cannot oppress us, but also that my neighbor cannot oppress me. Personal, public. You see? And it flows from natural God-given rights. The fact that you have life, you have the right to defend it. That's the idea. Okay? By the way, if we want to get rid of that, remember I was mentioning probably the most well-trained in our society tend to lean which way? Conservative. So how do we get them to give up their guns? And you can start hearing more and more talk of veterans. All veterans are mentally unstable. You see what I'm saying? The ones that can use it tend to lean one way. Everyone else is scared of it, and they already have them. But anyways, so modern thought seems to trend in the opposite direction of keeping and bearing arms. 1911, Turkey established gun control. From 1915 to 1917, 1.5 million Armenians, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. 1929, the Soviet Union established gun control. From 1929 to 1953, about 20 million dissidents, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. Germany established gun control in 1938, and from 1939 to 1945, a total of 13 million Jews and others who were unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. China established gun control in 1935. From 1948 to 1952, 20 million political dissidents unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Guatemala established gun control in 1964, and from 1964 to 1981, 100,000 Mayan Indians unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Uganda established gun control in 1970. From 1971 to 1979, 300,000 Christians unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Colombia established gun control in 1956, and from 1975 to 1977, 1 million, quote, educated people unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. Defenseless people rounded up and exterminated in the 20th century because of gun control, 56 million people. And by the way, history is still being written. I wonder if it's going to say in 2026, the United States established gun control. I don't know what it'll read. Statements from our founders. Let me just read a few of these briefly. George Washington. A free people ought not only be armed, but disciplined. Thomas Jefferson. I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. Oh, that's a good one. That was in a letter to James Madison. Another letter to James Madison. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. I wonder what Thomas Jefferson would say today to us. Now, folks, we have a lot of political commentaries on radio and whatnot. And I'm glad for the stand that they take. And I'm glad for the things that they say. But when they start looking at oppression, they start looking at where the government's crossing the lines, they're always saying this right afterwards. No, I'm not saying it's time to take up arms. Now, I'm not asking for a revolution, personally. But you know, we have so far surpassed the grievances that led to the Declaration of Independence. Now, if you've read the Declaration of Independence, it says in there, Let me bring it up real quick. There's one phrase that I want to bring to your attention. The Declaration of Independence. We all know this phrase. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, here are the rights: the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? They're all going to flow from those categories, really. That to secure these rights, the whole purpose to secure the rights, governments are instituted among men. Why do we have governments? To help us to secure rights. For who? For the people. Not for the government, for the people. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, bottom up, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, to what ends? That they secure the rights for the people. When they become destructive to that ends, has your government given you more or taken away more rights? I was challenged with this thought when we were at the Awake America. One of the former congressmen was there, and he said, every new law takes away some measure of rights. I was like, that's interesting. He said, you know why there's homelessness in the streets? It goes back to laws and regulations. You know why he started just pointing out all these things that are really impacting our society as a whole, and he says, laws and regulations attached to each of these. Liberty allows us to thrive. That's why I appreciated when Trump said, for every new regulation, you had to take away so many. I was like, that's the way to go. Let's start chiseling away at this thing. I mean, think about the founders. They're so brilliant that they constructed a document that would govern our society thoroughly, that will fit in your breast pocket. Can you imagine trying to write the Constitution today? We won't fit in this room. I mean, to secure these rights, governments instituted among men. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to, here's where we're at today, suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms of which they are accustomed. That's where we're at today. You know what we need to do? We need to go to D.C. and say, it's time to change. It's time to, abolish. That's where I believe we're at. Am I calling us to arms? No. Yeah, I just did what the talk show guys are doing. But I wonder what Thomas Jefferson would say, and James Madison. I wonder if they would say to us, when is enough enough, America? Well, I've got my TikTok. Folks, that's by design. Because this helps make it sufferable. This is my escape. You see what I'm saying? And we've completely lost sight of what's America going to look like for these kids when they're in our shoes. What's America going to look like for my grandchildren that haven't been born yet? When's enough enough? So why are these things so important? Because they gave us the Second Amendment. They recognized, rather, the Second Amendment so that we could go moose hunting, guys. They wanted us to be able to feed our family. Isn't that nice of them? No. They wanted us to be prepared to fulfill what was written in the Declaration of Independence, that if need be, we overthrow them again. That's what it was about, folks. Secondarily, my neighbor, that they don't just come in and overtake my home. The right to protect my family and my property. These things are important. And that's what the founders had in mind. Benjamin Franklin. The thoughtful reader may wonder, why hasn't Jefferson's proposal of no free man shall ever be debarred for the use of arms adopted by the Virginia legislature? They can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety, deserve neither liberty nor safety. Ben Franklin. George Mason. To disarm the people is the most effectual way to enslave them. Oh boy, I've got so many. I know we're out of time. Noah Webster. Before a standing army can rule, an army that will go against the citizenry, before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every country in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops. Now, I do believe this, in the day and age we live in, how important public opinion is and all those kinds of things. Because here's the argument, and here's the argument that Joe Biden would bring up. You think the citizenry can go against the force of the United States Armed Forces? Now, if it was a battle of arms, the answer is no. Well, let me just say to that, do you think those rebels in the colonies could withstand the greatest military might the world has ever seen? They did. But it's really not about who's stronger. It's about willing to take a stand. Do you guys remember several years ago the issue with the farmers there in, what was that, Nevada, or I'm trying to remember where that was, and they stood against the federal government? Who was more armed? Well, the feds, of course. But they wouldn't dare cross this line. Because what would happen across America? You see what I'm saying? And now more so today, we have phones all the time running and all this kind of stuff. What I'm saying is it'd be a huge deal if we had a Tiananmen Square issue where they'd start rolling over people's tanks. But it's only going to happen, like Franklin said, either we will all hang together or we're all going to hang separately. That's so important to understand. Are we there yet? No. But let me just say, I think this has to be in the back of our mind. We need to be a well-regulated militia. We need to understand the importance to keeping to bear arms. And we need to understand that when they start coming for guns, what's next? What's next? So the gun argument's a big deal. It's a big deal. What are they doing? They're saying things like, the NRA, they just love killing people. How many of these mass shooters were NRA members? And by the way, does the NRA promote handling with guns irresponsibly? No. In fact, if I remember, any NRA involvement was actually, what was the one there was very little coverage on? It was an NRA member that took out a shooter, right? I think he was a trainer or something. Let's look at the Bible basis. There's so many more quotes I could bring you. Let me just give this some biblical thought real quick. First of all, Jesus Christ is King of kings and Lord of lords, and seated at the right hand of the power on high, rules over the kingdoms of the earth. Daniel 4:17, Matthew 28:18, 1 Timothy 6:15, etc. Christ's commands are the first ground for our religious rights. He commands us to believe on him, to repent and believe the gospel, to receive the truth, to obey him in all things. In a sense, we must obey God rather than man. No law formed by man interfering with our obedience to his command shall be lawful. Jesus commanded his disciples to purchase a sword. We read that earlier. He did not express this as a suggestion. He emphasized that they needed to be armed, saying that if they have to sell their coat to procure a sword, they should do so. Since the sword is not used in a way to butter one's bread, but in defense of one's life and property and liberty, it is clear that Jesus understood that we need a physical sword in his absence. This is true even though he had given the civil sword of vengeance to civil government, Romans 13. It seems reasonable, since he calls those who hold the sword ministers of God, that the servants of God should wield the sword, if anybody should. Since the powers that be are ordained of God, those who are the children of Almighty God ought certainly to have the right to lay hold of that sword. The idea that Romans 13 places government beyond the reach of the Christian, who are the kings and priests unto God, ambassadors of his kingdom, is absurd, since in fact Romans 13 tells us the powers are under the authority of his ordaining power. We've talked about that in length before. And so let there be no more foolish talk about the church, about Christians being barred from the privilege to hold and execute the sword or wrath upon those that do evil. Now, I'm not saying we take matters in our own hands. There's a lawful way to do things, but in this instance about the Second Amendment is the right to defend ourselves, okay? Even to the point of taking someone's life who's trying to take yours. Okay. Next, in Luke 11, the 17th to 26, Jesus provides an analogy of a parable that's fitting to this purpose. In this parable, Jesus is addressing the accusation that the source of his power he demonstrated over devils was not from Beelzebub. His argument begins by showing that this accusation is unreasonable, for a house divided against itself cannot stand. So if Satan be divided against himself, how shall his kingdom stand? He turns their argument upon them, saying, if I by Beelzebub cast out devils, whom do your sons cast them out? He then explains exactly what he's up to in casting out devils. But if I with the finger of God cast out devils, no doubt the kingdom of God has come unto you. What he's saying is very important for us to consider in light of the question before us. Jesus acknowledges that anyone with sense immediately accepts this truism, that when a strong man that is armed in his palace, his goods are in peace. But when a stronger than he shall come upon him and overcome him, he taketh from him all his armor wherein he trusted, and divided his spoils. The simple truism sits at the heart of this virtual center of his explanation of his ministry. Essentially, Satan, the strong man, armed and keeping his palace in peace. However, the stronger than Satan has come, that is Jesus Christ, and he has overcome the strong man, and that the reason Jesus can so easily drive away the devils. Then Jesus says effectively that those who are not with him in the spoiling of the devil's palace are against him. Those who do not gather up the spoil with him scattereth. The word scattereth means disperse or scatter. Those who do not gather up spoil of the devil with the Lord run off and hide. To clarify that he's talking about, he offers an example. When the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, the unclean spirit walketh throughout the dry places, seeking rest, and findeth none. He said, I'll return to the house whence I came out. And when he cometh, he findeth it swept and garnished. Then goeth he and taketh to him 7 spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there, and the last state of the man is worse than the first. So what does this mean? Jesus, the Lord, has come and overcome the strong man. He has spoiled his house. He had taken the armaments of the devil that occupied the house and driven them off. He left us as a house clean and garnished. When we are charged to occupy till he return, we are told to not give place to the devil, to submit to God, to resist the devil, that he might flee before us. But because we have failed to occupy, to refuse place to the devil, and to resist him, the devils that were driven out from our house have reasserted themselves and are coming back with a vengeance to storm and reoccupy the house. So the case now is reversed. When God raised up this country, the devils of tyranny occupying the room and the power were driven out. They've long been outcast, wandering around. And what has happened? It's been swept, it's been garnished, but there's become a void. The void of the truth of the gospel, the void of Christian soldiers occupying till he comes. He'd given us a great gift in America. And what has happened? 7 worse than him are coming. And we could probably go down the list and just say, you know what? I bet we can name 7 right now. And the latter state is worse than the first. And I think we can even make a case that the state of America today possibly could be worse than prior to the revolution. Just to give a spiritual parallel is what I'm saying. See, this is why it's so important. We overcome the strong man. Now, I will say this. It's not just with the physical sword, but it is indeed with the spiritual sword. And we cannot separate the two. That's why we say God and gun cleaners. That's what we are. Today, we must be like Nehemiah's workmen, with the sword in one hand and with the trowel in the other. And we'll work till Jesus comes and we'll be gathered home. I skipped over a lot of stuff, but I hope that was just kind of giving us a little bit of history, a little bit of Bible as we consider this. But I think one of the biggest things is the fact that by virtue of creation and God stamping his image in his likeness in our image, we are to defend that. The very first civil law God gave was, if somebody kills innocent blood, his blood will be shed. What's that all about? What God thinks about this stuff. Okay. I hope that was a help to you as we get through this. There are some really interesting ones coming up as we get into the other amendments. We'll start doing several at a time, but the first 2, I believe, are the most important. And you will not have any of the others if you don't have the second. Sadly, governments are instituted to secure all the rights. But what happens when they fail? We have to secure them. I know we don't want to think like that, do we? But what else is left? If the ballot box fails you, Supreme Court checks and balances to fail you, you have taxation without representation because your representatives fail you. Let me ask you, what is next? Christians, watch and pray. Watch and pray. And then in a couple months, vote. Let's pray. Father, thank you for our time together tonight. Thank you for this church, Lord, that we're able to address some of these issues and dive into this. I know this is not popular. Even in this kind of more conservative part of the world, I know there are several churches in town that would really have a problem with some of the stuff we've talked about tonight. I just thank you for this church and that we can address these things. Thank you for the great gift that America has been to this world and that we can carry the light of the gospel. Lord, I just pray that you stir Christians up. I pray that you send a revival, that we will make the most of our remaining time. No doubt, Lord, the hour is late, and we are running out of time. Lord, I pray we not lose sight of the most important thing, that we bear the sword of the Spirit, but we also have a sword in our belt. Lord, help us to discern. Help us to have wisdom.